Hello and welcome. I want to talk in this video about the desire for revenge, and you know it well. That desire to inflict pain and suffering on the one who wronged you. And it's something that's never talked about, but it lives in all of us. Those thoughts we have of exacting revenge on an enemy. You imagine every step, and you're methodical. How you would hurt them, how you'd torture them, what you would say, and how it would play out. We've all done this in our minds, but we're all too scared and ashamed to say just how much time we've spent reflecting on these scenarios. But it's as common as a dirty thought. This need for revenge, it's reflected through all areas of society, through the media, through the justice system. We don't talk about it. We hide it away. Instead, we just sit back and cheer on Liam Neeson as he dispatches another horde of Albanian gangsters. But revenge, it's a primal urge. If someone insults you, you play it out in your mind, what you'd say, how you'd strike back. And it feels a hell of a lot more empowering than feeling helpless. These thoughts, they're how we insulate ourselves from feeling helpless and from experiencing that vulnerability. But revenge, it isn't just about the act of inflicting hurt or even taking back control. At its core, it's a deep felt need for the other person to not only understand our experience and our pain, but to live it, to live that pain, so they can understand. So revenge at its basis, at its very core, is still a need for connection. And these thoughts, they give you a sense of control. You suffer trauma, you receive an insult or something triggers you. Your physiology, it goes into overdrive. And that rage response, that anger response, it's not a response to the hurt being inflicted, but rather from the feelings we experience. And what's needed in that moment is understanding and acknowledgement. And those responses, if they're not addressed and worked through, they can cripple a man. The most important thing a man can do in that moment is acknowledge his hurt. And it's amazing how hard this step is, especially for a male. And this is what a lifetime of messages of man up and enforced stereotypes of masculine stoicism does to a male. Because ask yourself, when you get angry, what degree of vulnerability do you allow yourself to feel? You may feel it after the fact, when your adrenaline starts to dissipate and you start shaking like a leaf. Then you feel vulnerable. That fear over what you did or what could have happened. And I've experienced that fear many times. You literally see your life play out in front of you, your immediate present, and what your future might look like behind bars or whatever. And it's similar to a near-death experience. And inside each man, in that moment of rage, is a child that needs to be protected. So what happens? You go on the attack. You need to take your power back. And this anger reaction, it stops any further introspection. And you never get to identify the hurt that sparked this reaction. So, if you never allow yourself to experience this vulnerability, how can you identify triggers? How can you protect yourself? Because a man without awareness is a response automation. He's just reactive with no further clarity. And that confusion only leads to more suffering and to more manipulation. I look around today and I look at relationships. Relationships between men and women today, they're a cesspool of unconscious resentment. And the degrees to which people overcompensate, and the degree to which we employ cognitive dissonance in relationships, all of that, it gets suppressed. And you can convince yourself up and down that your relationship is working, that you're happy. But that resentment, along with the guilt of having thoughts of violence or hurtful intent towards your partner, it always leads to self-hatred. You picture it. You're sitting across from your partner at dinner, and she's talking, and she won't shut up. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking how good it would feel to stick your fork in her face just so she would understand you. That she wouldn't invalidate your feelings for once. And that sounds shocking, but if this was a woman saying this about her husband, I'd be getting applauded by a studio audience right now. But, of course, men can't have these thoughts, can they? But this is it. This is how men are turned into footstools and lapdogs for women and society. Because these men, they're living in a perpetual state of guilt, of self-loathing. They're emotionally dead. And a man, he can often feel guilt for having these thoughts of violence and revenge, sometimes against those closest to him. The same people who don't respect his sacrifices and who exploit his love. And these thoughts, at their core, they're a cry to the world, saying, I matter. My feelings, my experience is valid, and I want you to acknowledge it. But as men, we don't cry out. We hide away. And you look close enough and you'll see it. Footprints across the back of most men, just human escalators. You're never forming their lips to mouth the words that their dignity, their time, their lives, their rights are more important than the precious feelings of those around them. The same people who degrade and exploit them. And these same men, they never voice that this pretense of a society is a soul-destroying nightmare for most men. And this is the way it is for so many males. A life of shame and silent resentment. So, furthering our understanding and awareness, it's the best defense a man can have. And we need to trace that pain, we need to trace that vulnerability and fear into our past and identify the triggers. Because there's a lot of ticking time bombs out there. I was one of them. And if you fly blind on autopilot, you will bring the past into the present. And that hurt will be intensified tenfold. And nobody stuck up for the child you once were. No one stood up for you when you were subjected to ongoing systematic abuses by your ex-partner and the courts. But now you're awake. You're awake, and you've made the promise to yourself that no one is going to hurt you again. You're going to make sure of that. And you're going to fight. And you're going to do whatever it takes to protect yourself. I lived this. I lived it. And so many men do. They just become reactive. Every perceived slight is augmented in the mind. Everything is scrutinized. Every remark, every gesture. And you're waiting. You're anticipating. You're waiting for your chance to lash out. And it's a chance that rarely eventuates. So you end up swinging at ghosts in the dark. So instead, that need to lash out, that resentment, it has nowhere else to go. So it gets turned inwards. And this is standard practice for men. Because where else are they going to turn? So a man, he reaches for the bottle to numb his pain. Or he acts out, he shuts down his emotions, and he justifies every action. And that man, he destroys himself from the inside out. And subconsciously, he's wanting the world to feel remorse or some degree of guilt over what they've done to him. And this happens a lot when you see men state that what they've experienced is something that no one else can understand until they themselves have experienced it. And it pushes people away. It's their protective buffer. But in reality, it's a cry for help. And it stems from a need for connection. And it's our go-to. Experiencing rage, anger, it's a deflection. So we don't have to experience vulnerability. We don't have to experience pain. And you see this online when people dig their heels in and get defensive. Of course, the medium lends itself to that. So it's easier just to claim you feel nothing, rather than face the hurt. And it's like a child stamping their feet. They're seeking attention. Then they just storm off in a sulk, angry at the parent for ignoring their needs. And it's misguided, it's confused. And to forgive means to let go. At some point, a man has to let go, for the sake of his health, for the sake of his well-being, but most of all, so he can finally be free. We talk about risks. We talk about the marriage trap. We talk about risks in relationships and what's involved. But, I've said it before. Man's greatest enemy will always be himself. And he's the only one who can unlock his chains. And there's a lot of men that fall into this trap. I was in that space for many years. There's a lot of men who continue to suffer, who keep putting themselves in harm's way. And part of it is the messages we're fed as men. Another part is our biology, and also the unconscious process of repeating past behaviour. Coping mechanisms we've had, in some cases since childhood, and as a result, many men continue to put themselves at risk. And this inability to understand or even acknowledge this unconscious process, it leads to a man adopting a victim mentality. A man suffers setback after setback. He suffers humiliations, abuse, continuing abuse, and he will feel victimized by the world. And he refuses to do any introspection and accept his own responsibility in his actions. And this is the seed of anger, of this desire for revenge. In the process, it starts in childhood for many men. Men, they're well trained in masochism. As a child, living in a situation where there is abuse, physically or emotionally, where there's parentification or spousification, that child will identify with that abusive parent. They will justify that caregiver's actions as warranted, that they were somehow deserving of it. And they'll fly as close to the sun as they can because that feels like the safest place. It's familiar. And blame and anger toward the parent is directed at the only safe target available, themselves. And this will be a pattern that will play out over and over again in later life. And those who are abused in childhood, they have a much higher chance of being abused as adults, due to the decisions they make and due to a lack of understanding or insight into their own actions. It's just much easier to just punish yourself rather than attempt to punish a world that doesn't care. And this self-punishing, it brings with it a sense of empowerment. And every time he's kicked in the teeth as an adult, he can then hold up his trauma and his disappointments. He can signpost it for all the world to see. He gets to hold all of us accountable. The world is cruel, and he's walking proof. And he makes sure that everyone sees his scars. And he won't let go of his pain or forgive. Because to do so means looking at his pain. Means opening up old wounds and letting go. His pain defines him. And in order to let go, he has to hold up the mirror to himself. And if he doesn't recognize the triggers, if he can't connect the dots, he will self-sabotage. And he will stay in the victim mindset. And a lot of this is subconscious. But the fact is, only you can help yourself. A man needs to take responsibility for himself. I did. And you've hit rock bottom. Great. Great. It's the best foundation to build a house on, because the only way is up. And every step is a battle, but the biggest battle is the internal one. And people, they'll tell you things will get better. Well, that's bullshit. You make things better. You work at it. You suffer so you can feel again. And you move forward because no one else will help you unless you first help yourself. And it's a painful, awful process of self-realization. It's ugly. And it's very messy. And you will feel like you're losing control. Good. To restore balance and peace in your life, you have to let go. It's like a child, stumbling through life. A man can become lost. Now he doesn't understand, and he can't make sense of people's behavior, and he has no insight into why he engages in the behavior he does. So he lives empty, chasing an acceptance that will never come. Of course, his confidence gets eroded, and a wall of scar tissue goes up. It's like an angry dog that lashes out at the world. He would crumble if someone just took the time to show it, just the first sign of tenderness. And this is what men conceal every day. All this anger and feelings of victimization. They're just like a child from an unstable home or abusive household. These men, they formulate the same coping strategy. Whatever it takes to numb their pain. Drugs, alcohol, pornography, sex, whatever. Every behavior recover. A deflection from the hurt. It's a deflection from that vulnerability. And when someone pulls them up on it, their reaction, of course, is anger. It's their shield. But we as men, we have choices. When we get hurt or insulted, we have the choice to lash out or inflict hurt, or we can speak our mind. In order to be able to speak out when someone hurts us, we need to first be able to recognize that hurt and accept it as harmful or abusive. And this is vital, because it stops the anger from leading to anything destructive, especially self-destructive. And you need to communicate what you're feeling in that moment. And this is different to lashing out. And we need to be able to discern the difference. Because one is a blind reaction, just fueled by unconscious hurt and anger, and the other is a means of asking for further clarification. When you do speak up, you have no control over how the other person will react. So I think a lot of the times we just place very unrealistic expectations on people. We expect them to act in a certain way, according to our moral code. But life, it's not black and white. It's just shades of grey. And all it does is frustrate you and cause the other person to get defensive, and often very aggressive, and it achieves nothing. When somebody hurts you, whether physically or verbally or by proxy, allow yourself to feel that hurt. Then pull them up on it. Find your voice and then forgive them. Because what's the alternative? I've said it before, holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. You have a choice. You can shift your mindset. You can let go of the hatred and all the negative, repetitive thoughts. And you stop dwelling on outcomes that will never eventuate. You let go of the rage and the resentment. You stop living like a victim. You stop blaming the world and everyone in it. Because it's only when you understand your anger and understand your triggers, when you stop dwelling on thoughts of inflicting hurt on others or of ways to gain control, only then can you forgive. I walked a dark, destructive path for many years, and what choices I've made have resulted in a lot of pain for myself and other people, and I justified every choice. If you stay in the role of victim, you don't allow yourself opportunities for growth. You stagnate. And holding on to pain, holding on to anger and resentment, it's what I did for years. And shutting out the perspective of others, it does nothing but serve to insulate and isolate yourself. And the only one who can help you is you, and I learned that the hard way. And letting go, forgiveness, that's the first step. Because the majority of people do not care about your problems. And the rest of the world are just glad that you have them. Men going their own way, MGTOW. At least how I've applied it to my life. To me, it's about understanding. And I mentioned the following. I mentioned this to someone recently. That I'm concerned that men aren't looking deeper. That I see men who have been manipulated. I see men that have been lied to and used, and as a result, abused. But that men, at some point, if they want to move forward, they will need to acknowledge that they were lied to, and that his decisions were a part of that outcome. And those decisions he was responsible for, but of course he had no idea that the outcome would lead to the abuses he suffered. But acknowledging that his decisions played a part, that's awareness, and it's a form of forgiveness. And a man in that space can then help men better understand their experience, and he becomes a torchbearer. And not forgiveness for the person who did the hurt, but so he can be released from that burden. I lived for most of my life in a space where I was deprived, where I was angry, where I was very bitter, where I was self-punishing. And that is the last thing I want for other men. I want them to be free. Because you suffer trauma, and it rocks your belief system. That trauma then shapes your beliefs about justice, about human nature, about relationships with other people. After being beaten down for so long, man, he faces a huge uphill battle. So it's no wonder that revenge is such an attractive option. And it's a much easier option. Why look inside when you can lash out? When you can attribute blame solely onto other people? That way you get your power back. And that is a nice, tidy thought. But the reality is far different. Now you take a gun or a knife and you go get your revenge. That action does not bring relief. What you've done, you've compounded your trauma. It hasn't dissipated the original symptoms of the original memory. And that same memory that plays over and over in your mind, well, now it has a companion. The horror of the action that you've taken. Now, I've seen a lot of people dismiss this reasoning that no, that this wouldn't have an effect on me. No, not on my psyche. If I went out and took revenge, no, not me. Well, look at the men in the trenches. Look at war veterans. Look at the shells of the men who have to live with the horror of their actions. Look at veteran suicide statistics and see the reality for yourself. And with war veterans, what you see, especially in group therapy with veterans who have been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, you see a number of stages before recovery can take place. And the first step, it's a bonding phase. Veterans, they exchange stories, they share similar experiences, and they identify with one another and with one another's experiences in the field. And they talk about the experience of returning veterans, the obvious lack of support, politicians' lack of support, the lack of resources, and so on. And this bonding is important, as it lays the groundwork for what's to come. And the facilitator, he's just that. He facilitates. The work is done between the veterans themselves. And what needs to occur, in order for these men to progress, is that they need to be 100% committed to taking personal responsibility for their issues and finding solutions, rather than externalizing blame. And this is key. Because with veterans, as sessions continue, the group needs to progress past assigning blame to politicians or focusing on the lack of support for veterans. Because all this does is foster a victim mentality. And the real progress is made when they move past their safe zone. The zone of placing blame on the system, on the VA, on politicians. Otherwise, the group members form a codependency, where they just feel impotent and full of rage, but still looking towards the system for a solution. And it's a solution that, in all truth, can only come from inside them. And there's a lot of men in this situation. I was in that space for many years. And I don't say these words to hurt. I say them because I want to spare men the pain that I suffered through. And if I don't say it, if I just allow men to play it safe and foster a codependency, then I'm allowing men to continue to suffer. People tried to reach me, and I never listened. Now to me, taking the red pill, it means furthering your understanding, not just stopping at basic generalizations and not looking deeper, because we're not entitled to a goddamn thing. None of us are. We earn it, and we are not special. But I've seen this in groups, a sense of entitlement creeps in. Members of the group, they become dependent on the dialogue always moving in a certain way. And there can be no expression of other needs without censorship or just immediate invalidation of these needs. Now, I've seen this online, in forums or in comments. A man says he wants to experience intimacy with a female again. Well, what he's just expressed is invalidated by the men. I've seen it happen. And it shuts down discussion, and that man clams up, and he doesn't feel safe to share again. And all it leads to is that man becoming increasingly isolated. So with discussion at such a controlled and censored level, it becomes a case of enabling. We need to move away from that, or the hurt continues. So you have to choose victim or survivor. Because a victim, they cut themselves off from growth. They cut themselves off from opportunity and from support. But a survivor, they move forward proactively. He takes back control and utilizes his support networks. And this is what we need to be striving towards. And it gets a hell of a lot worse before it gets any better. Because exploring trauma in a group environment is just like ripping your guts out and slapping them on the table for everyone to see. That's how exposed a man feels. And what you experience during or soon after the trauma, well, those symptoms, they intensify again during therapy, during group work. And we're talking for weeks on end. Now for veterans, they're back in hell all over again. It's like running head first into a wall over and over again. It's confronting head on. Confronting sometimes years of intrusive thoughts, years of trauma playing out. While all that time they were suppressing and living in a state of denial. And now for the first time in a group setting, that man has nowhere to hide. And he's made the promise to his brothers to face his trauma. And he's scared. He feels helpless. But it's temporary. And he may disassociate, but this is a necessary step. And it's also important that men suffering from alcoholism and other addictions, that they're clean when they enter these group dynamics, because their reasoning is inhibited, and it can lead to very erratic and often violent behavior. But processing trauma, facing your vulnerability, that's where real strength comes from. And what strength is resilience. It's the capacity to be adaptive, and it's a shift in mindset, where trauma becomes a catalyst or the stimulus for change in thoughts and actions. And you create a different reality. You train your brain and your physiology to react in a way that fosters positive thoughts and actions. And it's coming to the understanding that we as men, we have choices.